away from the election, and there's a lot of information out there. Here are 3 things you need to know from the Bipartisan Policy Center. 1. There will be a surge in voting by mail, which is safe and secure. And 2. You likely won't know who won on election night, since it will take longer to count all the ballots and report the results. And finally, your usual polling site might be different to keep you and poll workers safe. Check out canivote.org if you're not sure where to go. By planning ahead and knowing what to expect, you can make sure your voice is heard at the ballot box.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Gourmet with the BPC. I hope you enjoyed our short public service announcement. As you might imagine, we think that participation is actually really important in participatory democracy, so I hope that everybody is making a plan to be part of the franchise. Today we have another very important topic of conversation, and that's what is shareholder capitalism and what does it mean for corporate governance? This is a conversation that we've had a few discussions about, and a topic that we think is going to be even more important as we move into next year. The question around shareholder versus stakeholder obligations and opportunities was pretty dynamic before the pandemic. And I think unquestionably, it is now one of the most significant discussions about the role of corporations in our society, having invested several $1 trillion in maintaining employment at small and large companies. A lot of additional questions now have been raised about the role of corporations in our communities. We have 2 panels today to talk about these issues. The first, I am delighted to have the chance to talk with someone I have worked with and admired for many years, Chris Womack with the Southern Company. I will then be introducing my colleague, Michelle Nellenbach, who will have a discussion with the 2 partner organizations we work with, Tom Quadman from the Chamber and Martin Whitaker from Just Capital. So let me just introduce Chris a little more, and then we'll just jump right in. Chris is the Executive Vice President and President of External Affairs for Southern Company. He directs public policy strategy, he oversees government affairs, corporate communications, and other kind of external and strategic engagements. Pretty broad scope of responsibility, but possibly even more important for today's session, Chris has been with Southern Company since 1988. You may remember 1988. Ronald Reagan was president. Telephones were firmly secured to the walls. The song "Gotta Have Faith" by George Michael was topping the charts. So I mention this because this conversation about the role of corporations has been a constantly evolving discussion. While we've been focused on it a lot for the last 18 months, it's been a focus of discussion within corporations since the beginning of corporations. And so really enjoy the opportunity, Chris, to think with you a little bit about how you have watched this discussion unfold over the years. And with that, let me just put my first question out there. Everyone, most people have heard about Southern Company, but I'm not sure that everyone understands kind of the scope of operations. And I wonder if you could just kind of provide us just a little bit as we get started, kind of a sense of where you're operating, what your core business lines are, and how that starts to kind of implicate these questions about role in community.
Jason, thanks. First, thanks for this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to engage with you and the Bipartisan Policy Center on kind of the issues du jour, the things that are happening in this country today, and that intersection between policy and politics and good governance and good responsibility. As you kind of bring these conversations, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. Southern Company, we're based here in Atlanta. We're serving a little bit more than 9 million customers all across the country, providing them with reliable electricity service, but also gas service, but also working with a bunch of individual customers to make sure that whatever needs they have for reliable service, we're providing that for them as well in terms of what individual solutions they want. Our company, we've made a major transition from principally being a coal-dominated generating company now to increasing renewables, using more natural gas, really jumping into innovation, all different forms of technology, and making bets in terms of how our economy and the work we do, how going forward will be a lot cleaner as we go forward. So we're really excited about the future, excited about the things we're doing, excited about the transitions that we're making inside of our company. I mean, it's not the same old Southern company that a lot of people knew some 10, 20 years ago. We've made a lot of changes inside of our company, particularly around our fuel mix, and we're looking forward to the advancements and the changes that are in front of us.
So, the kind of core question around shareholder capitalism is the question of kind of corporate engagement, responsibility, obligation, in particular to kind of their communities. And while every major employer has a significant relationship, the electric power sector is a little bit unique because you have a direct relationship with literally almost every single person in your community. And I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on how that creates additional, choices, obligations, but how the energy sector in that regard might be a little bit different than, a manufacturer who might employ 6,000 people, but isn't kind of touching everybody's lives all the time. Does that change your community relationship?
Not really, Jason. I mean, for us, it's something that we have taken seriously for a very long time, and we enjoy those relationships that we have with all of our customers. And so that really drives the work that we do. And as we always say, a lot of times the customer is at the center of what we do. And so that customer engagement, that engagement in those communities where they live and operate, and our commitment to making those communities better, to making our customers' lives better, is something that we take very seriously. And so sometime last year, and I think there was an enhanced conversation about all this, the stakeholder engagement and the governance conversation and the ESG conversations, and talking about the balance between shareholder interests and customer interests and the interests of employees and the interests of communities. And we always have viewed that as a balance in terms of we have to respond to the needs of all of our stakeholders. And that's kind of how we run our business. And even now, with all the intense focus on racial injustice and social injustice, I mean, it has challenged a lot of companies to talk about what is their role, what is their responsibility in addressing a lot of these challenges. And one of the things I always say is that I think companies and the corporate community and the business community must be an incredible strong leader, must have a strong voice in a lot of these conversations. I mean, I'm somewhat reluctant to say it, but I think these are not issues that government can challenge and can tackle. It's something that the business community and companies must lead on. And so we take this work very seriously in terms of what our roles and what our responsibilities are, and then what we must do to make things better.
So I want to talk a little bit about the conversation that you were very involved in, and that is ESG and climate change. The electric power sector and the energy industry is obviously incredibly diverse. So I can't fairly ask you to speak on behalf of everybody, but if you could just, kind of general sense, the Southern Company has made a commitment to have net zero emissions by 2050, and some very clear kind of markers along the way. As you point out, you can't always rely on government to lead. There's no federal obligation that you do this. And so talk a little bit about what has been the role of your customers and your community in encouraging you to take that action, kind of absent a federal requirement.
And Jason, we engage in very extensive stakeholder engagement processes where we will sit down with many of our environmental friends, with our community partners, with many of our shareholders, as well as our employees to talk about what we see in the future and how we will develop our strategy and how we will move into the future. Some 7, 8 years ago, we were probably in the neighborhood of 60 plus 70% coal was our principal source of generation. Today, it's less than 30% and maybe down in the mid 20s. And so as we make those transitions, I mean, there are a lot of conversations we have with all of our stakeholders in terms of how we will make this transition to be cleaner. The role that we engage in around innovation, the role that we engage in around research and development in terms of how do we make these transitions without having kind of an enormous community shock in terms of economic dislocation because of plant retirements, and also without increasing prices. So as we try to make these transitions and make these changes in how we run our business, we also try to make sure that we keep in mind all of our customers as we make these changes in terms of really being focused on being clean, safe, reliable, and affordable. And so as we do this, it requires a lot of conversation. Now, we've got to be very credible, we've got to be very forthright, and we've got to be very transparent in how we run our business. And those are some of the things that I think we really take pride in terms of the kind of conversations that we engage in, the partnerships we have with our regulatory bodies, with our various commissions, but also the engagement we have trying to meet the needs of all of our customers, being responsive and considerate to all of employees, but also the engagement and the investments we want to continue to make with our communities. We think we have to look at these kind of issues very holistically. And yeah, we know there's a lot of activism and conversations around ESG and environmental, social, and governance kinds of issues. And we welcome those conversations and we enjoy the conversations and the collaborations that we have there because we think we're on the right path. We think we're moving in the right direction. And we will continue to partner with all of our stakeholders to make sure that we're moving in the right direction, but we're also doing a good job of telling our story.
So I want to spend a couple minutes kind of hunkering down on an issue that you raised, which is, the role of corporations and the role of government. We live in a pretty binary world, and I often hear people kind of camped out in one place or the other, right? There's an assertion that government is just a broken enterprise, and so it's really just going to be corporate leadership. You hear other people who kind of think that that's something that's not reliable if it's not obligatory, and say we really just have to have kind of government mandates. Help me unpack that a little bit. In other words, I feel like there's obviously some combination of actors and actions that are going to be necessary to deal with the kind of structural issues we're facing. But you're taking a leadership position now on climate change. Not all of your competitors are. At what point, and what are the ways in which you need the federal government, whether it's on climate change or worker training? Where can the federal government, in an active way, be actually supportive of the kind of leadership that Southern Company and others, I think, are really eager to display?
No, clearly, Jason. I mean, there are certainly roles and responsibilities and leadership that I think government must take, whether it's on tax policy and whether it's on sensible energy policy and comprehensive energy policy, and not just focuses on one element of energy policy in terms of, but the whole gamut, the whole continuum, the whole spectrum. We think government, yeah, should lead in that regard. But I think in many aspects there are things that we simply must do as we run our business. And so as we move to and focus on net zero by 2050, as we make investments in different technologies, as we look at whether it's different sequestration, whether it's different fuel sources and different innovation, we think those are things that, yeah, we must simply do as a business and make the investments and be a leader in that regard. So we can't always wait on government. Yes, we want to be partners, and we have been good partners with government. We've done a lot of wonderful research work with the Department of Energy on various carbon capture technologies. And we look forward to those kind of partnerships and working together going forward. At the same time, as this economy moves forward, as this economy advances, as skill training is needed in certain areas, the things we must do in terms of focusing on diversity from a governance standpoint around our boards, around the makeup of our workforce, the things we do with various suppliers, and the investments we must make in our communities to help improve distressed and disadvantaged communities. Yes, we think there are wonderful opportunities to collaborate and partner with government. At the same time, we think there are things that we must do. We decided in January to make a $50 million commitment to historically black colleges and universities. because we think there's an opportunity there to really take advantage and partner with those institutions with the great work they do today in terms of how we can help them work on curriculum around coding and more technological kinds of curriculum, so that the students that come out of there can move into this new economy. And many of the students at those institutions are first generation students. I mean, they're first in their families to go to college. So they get a wonderful education. They come out and get a good job. We change their lives, but we also change the conditions of their entire family. So I think there are just a lot of places where we as a business must jump in, be leaders. But yeah, I think it would be wonderful also to make sure that we continue to partner with government in trying to address many of these challenges.
So let me ask a maybe final question, because I think it's probably a good transition to our next panel. We are all hoping that we obviously get the pandemic under control and can start to, in a kind of full-throated way, begin to rebuild our economy and find new sources of employment. Southern Company is very engaged in understanding the economic realities faced in your communities. I'm wondering if you have anything that you could share. If you were advising, the Congress, a closely divided Congress, on what it could do that you think would kind of bring back, stimulate economic activity, are there one or two things that you think the Congress should be focused on?
I think it starts with a good plan for dealing with COVID. I mean, one of the things that I know that we had to do, because we couldn't turn the power off.
You're essential workers, yeah.
I mean, we're essential, and so we had to put in place protocols to make sure that, first of all, we protected the safety of our workers. I mean, that's our principal priority. But at the same time, we have to keep the power on. We have to keep the gas flowing. And so, but we have to do that with appropriate protocols. So we went through and put a team of people together to put an aggressive plan together about how we were going to run our business. And so I think those kind of things and those kind of learnings are essential for this country, for this economy, to get back going, to make sure we have a pretty thorough, comprehensive plan that addresses all the elements and all the issues of COVID, but just make sure that we've got a good, thorough, comprehensive plan. I think that's how we move forward. That's how we advance and get back to whatever the new normal will be. But I think it's a real big focus on a comprehensive approach to every aspect of the COVID pandemic.
All right, I'm going to violate my own rule and ask you one more question, which is something that's probably a little more controversial than some of the other things we've spoken about. But the question of kind of business liability risk and whether that actually poses an obstacle, not just to major companies, but to kind of Main Street organizations getting back together, remains one of the sticking points in the stimulus conversation. Not expecting that we're all going to have a necessarily consensus view, but where do you come down on that? Is that something that you think is critical? You think it's being a little exaggerated? Like, how do you get your arms around that conversation?
No, I think it's a real issue in terms of from a liability perspective. And so, what's the magnitude of it? I really don't know, but I think it is a real issue, and I do think it's important for both sides to come together and find some balance resolution, so that we kind of take that off the table, but also give employers the kind of safety and security they need to reopen and bring their workers back and get business going again. So it's one of those things that, once again, I think you get two sides together and really dig into the issue and find common ground, and let's move on.
All right, well, I wanted to spice things up for our second panel, but Chris, I know how much you got going on. Most people don't know that Chris is also in the middle of actually a Southern Company board meeting. He is got remarkable ability to have cognitive dissonance and speak and listen at the same time, but really appreciate you taking the time for this conversation. Really enjoy our partnership with you all, and look forward to getting back together maybe early next year and continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks very much.
So my pleasure now to introduce my colleague, Michelle Nellenbach, who will lead the second panel.
Well, thank you very much, Jason and Chris. That was a really enlightening, interesting conversation, and I think set the table pretty well for our next panel, I'm going to refer you to our website for more information on their specific bios, but I'm thrilled to once again be joined by Tom Quadman, who is the Executive Vice President at the U.S. Chamber Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness. He can be found on Twitter at Quadman with two A's. T. And then Martin Whitaker, who is the CEO of Just Capital, and he also is on Twitter at @MWhitaker. And so please, again, refer to our website for a little bit more detail about everybody. And I would encourage everyone to add questions to the live chat on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter using # BPC Live. I'll ask a couple questions and then turn it over to you, the audience member. So thank you so much for joining us all. So let's just dive right in here. So obviously the title of our event today is What Does Stakeholder Capitalism Mean for Corporate Governance? So let's start there. Why don't we start with Tom? Could you talk a little bit about how you view stakeholder capitalism, what it entails, and how it differs from shareholder primacy capitalism? And then we'll turn it over to Martin to get his thoughts.
Thank you, Michelle and Martin. Good to be back with both of you again as well. At the Chamber, we advocate for policies that, create the atmosphere for, vibrant business community, a growing economy. Because, with that, what you do is you raise the standard of living for everyone. And at the same time, you actually strengthen the freedoms that we all hold dear here in this country, in our democracy. And, when Jason mentioned 1988 before, sort of sent me down memory lane a little bit. For two reasons. One is, and I think I'm dating myself now, fall of 1988, I studied corporations law in law school. And the first thing I was taught there was that, corporations are not eleemosynary organizations. They're not charitable organizations. They're there to make a profit. They're there to make a return for investors. But one other thing I thought of, too, as I was taking that trip down memory lane, is as an Eagle Scout, it was drummed into my head that you leave your campsite better than you found it. And when you think of those two things together, that's sort of what stakeholder capitalism is about. And I think there's been a little bit of a false debate going on between this and Milton Friedman, because in Milton Friedman's op-ed in 1970, where he talked about the primacy of the shareholder or shareholder return, he also quickly followed that on in that same op-ed about the need for corporations to follow laws, to be good corporate citizens, et cetera. And there's a 1981 letter to the editor to the New York Times from the BRT that Senator Warren likes to hold up, where the part that she quotes is, corporations should be, good citizens, should treat their workers well, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's an ellipse. The end of that ellipse is, and none of this is possible without a profit. So I think, we'll dive into this a little deeper. There clearly is a role for corporations in terms of making our society better. That's part of what they're there for. But they're also there to serve their investors and their employees and others. So I'll just leave it there for now.
Great. You want to jump in here, Martin? And first,
Sure
also
thing.
tell everyone a little bit about Just Capital, too.
Sure, will do. Thanks, Michelle. Tom, great to be with you. Thanks to Jason, all our friends at BPC and at the Chamber. It's an important conversation, and I'm very glad we're having it. So Just Capital, just for those who don't know, as we're a nonprofit, independent 501c3, we effectively track how big corporations perform on the priorities of ordinary Americans. And we divine those priorities through a series of extensive survey and polling research all throughout the country. Every year, we've surveyed now well over 100,000 Americans on a fully representative basis. And then we take all those issues that are surfaced and we essentially track as honestly and as objectively as we can how large corporations are performing on them. And there are issues such as fair pay, how companies investing in their workforce, investing in training, how they invest in other stakeholders, the communities where they operate, local supply chains, how do they do on supporting needs of their customers, how do they do on environmental practices, and of course, how do they serve their shareholders? And I think we have learned over 6 years now of very detailed survey work that the stakeholder approach, based on the perspectives of Main Street America, has a lot of support. People see the role of corporations today as balancing the needs across all the stakeholders, not simply serving the short-term best interests of shareholders. And, in that regard, that's not that different from how leading CEOs would see and leading investors would see the role of business as well. Nobody who's running a business will pretend that all I care about and all I focus on is profits and profit maximization. Anybody worth their salt who's run any organization knows you got to invest in people. Of course, you have to invest in your customers. You care deeply about the communities where you operate, and that your environmental impact is essential. Has a direct implications for your financial and competitive performance, especially in certain industries. And the utilities industry is an obvious one. So it's really about balance. Chris made that point in his comments, and I thought it was a good one. It's about balance. The pendulum has swung too far in favor of shareholders, and we have forgotten what it means to create value for other stakeholders. That's what the Business Roundtable's restatement of the purpose of a corporation was all about. That's what the American people want. And the trick now is to define that. What does that mean? When we say create value for other stakeholders, how do we measure that? When we talk about stakeholder capitalism, what are we talking about? And when we think about whether that's in the best interest of shareholders or not, what does the data show? And our research and the research of many others would indicate that, in fact, it's better for shareholders, for a company to have this stakeholder point of view. It's not a question of a zero-sum game. Either I'm looking after my shareholders or I'm investing in my stakeholders. That's somewhat of a myth, So anyway, so that's the bigger picture, and I feel like that idea is really gaining momentum. And to Tom's point, Friedman, generously interpreted, acknowledged that there's a lot of things that went into companies' long-term sustainable profitability.
So let's dive into that a little bit more, Martin, because you talk about stakeholders, but for some companies and some communities, there are competing stakeholders. So, it obviously encompasses different groups. So how and where should we draw lines about who and what groups are or are not considered stakeholders for any given corporation?
Well, I think every company has the same basic set of stakeholders, right? They have workers, they have customers, they have communities where they operate, including their supply chains. Every company has an environmental impact in one way, shape, or form. Of course, they have investors, shareholders, and so on. So we have a universal sort of common starting point. Certainly, for some companies and some industries, companies find themselves, as this summer showed, having to make trade-offs. It was very difficult for many companies just to stay in business without laying workers off, for example. But I think this question of balance and this perspective of seeing the broader best interests of the corporation through this lens of the different stakeholders, as opposed to this is a zero-sum game. It's a trade-off. Either I'm investing in my customers, or I'm supporting the communities where I operate, or I'm lifting wages. For example, companies spent a lot of money this summer and made a lot of positive moves to provide hazard pay, better benefits, dependent care benefits, etc., to ensure that their workers were being looked after. And what we found is the companies that did that and that had a very strong sort of approach to investing in their human capital and their workforce, they did better throughout the pandemic, and they're coming out of it stronger. And in fact, they've outperformed in the marketplace. So I think I acknowledge there will be trade-offs, and I acknowledge that it's not a straight line. This is not easy. However, it behooves us to have a framework where we are looking at business value creation, business performance through the stakeholder model, so we can just be better at it. we can gather the right data, and we can make better decisions about those trade-offs.
Great. So Tom, let's Martin had mentioned the BRT statement. So the Chamber's been looking at these issues as well and looking at ways in which companies have more publicly acknowledged this broader set of stakeholders. Tell us a little bit more about how the Chamber is addressing this. You obviously have an incredibly diverse membership, companies of all kinds of sizes. So how are you all addressing these issues?
Yeah, we've been addressing these issues through concrete issues and working on concrete issues. So 5 years ago, we worked closely with Congresswoman Maloney and Congressman Meeks on corporate board diversity legislation, actually with Senator Menendez as well, because it is extremely important that boards represent, the employee base, the consumer base of a company, and that by having a diverse board, you're going to be able to better plan for the future and ensure the long-term strategy of a company. We came out with principles around environmental social governance disclosures last year that should be principles-based, as well as providing for portals of reporting that allow companies to talk amongst the different stakeholders that they're trying to communicate with. So investors, employees, consumers, vendors, but also to ensure that we're using the securities laws and securities disclosures in the appropriate way that they are so that it is linked back to materiality. This year, the Chamber launched the Equality of Opportunity Initiative to help ensure that that Blacks and other minorities are given the opportunities that they can grow businesses and be entrepreneurs to help lift all boats. And there are a number of interesting things that companies are doing there. So Square put a certain percentage of its cash into CDFIs, and Allstate is working with minority firms in some of their bond offerings. And it's not only to ensure that that Black financial firms are getting more business, but it's that they're developing the expertise so that they can also help deploy capital to allow Black entrepreneurs to start more high quality businesses and try and get to solve some of the problems that we've been vexed with for far too long through an economic approach. So it's using it's using the power of the corporation to do good, but also to ensure that we are also doing that in view of the long-term value return for investors. Because at the end of the day, these efforts have to be linked back to materiality, which isn't just a concept, it's actually a legal requirement. We also have to recognize that materiality changes. Climate change is a material issue for many businesses and their investors, and that's something that has to be addressed. But this is something where, on a principles basis, companies can do this in conjunction with their investor base and do so successfully.
Great, thank you. So I want to get into a little bit around how we measure all this, because there is a lot of talk about various standards and what companies or what activities count, and particularly institutional investors get a lot of pressure to invest in certain types of companies that are doing certain things, and there's a lot of different measurements out there. So really many different stakeholder interests could be priced into corporate returns. So for instance, a company that treated workers well would see a higher productivity than its peers and outperform them, presumably. So trying to account for a wide array of stakeholder interests in a more explicit way raises the challenge of how to address all of it. Could you talk a little bit about how you see this question of metrics and what progress we still need to make on measuring corporate performance in all these different aspects? Because I think the companies struggle a little bit with what metrics to follow.
Yeah, I guess I could jump in there. It is a struggle, right? And I think, if we take a little bit of a step back, let me give you one metric. We have half the number of public companies today that we did in 1996. And there are a few reasons for that. We have more robust private capital markets than we did previously. But we also have other issues where proxy advisory firms, as an example, which have been unregulated up until the last few months, were some investors and some management and directors felt that the proxy advisory firms were telling corporations to do things that weren't necessarily in their best interest. So many companies, when they were growing to a certain point, decided not to go public, or companies decided that they would rather go private than having to deal with some of that. It's interesting if you take a look at yesterday's New York Times, where CalPERS, right, which is one of the more foremost active corporate governance participants, said they have to get more involved in private equity in order to achieve their 7% annual return that they're required to by law in order to provide their pensions. There was a spectrum analysis done of opinion poll done of pensioners, public pensioners, back in 2018 that said, some of the things that public pension plans might be nice, but at the end of the day, it has to be about return that they're going to get their pensions. So we need to ensure that we are using that materiality guide to understand how stakeholder capitalism is providing for better return. Additionally, there are some in the asset management community that also feel we need to collect data over the next several years to really get a handle on stakeholder capitalism and ESG. And some of this is what was driving some of the BlackRock letters, so that we have some more data around that, so we can actually parse what is material from what is not material. So what are the important things versus some of the what would be nice to do things.
Martin, do you want to jump in here?
Oh, absolutely. This is the crux of the matter. Metrics and data around this stuff is one of the biggest challenges. Part of the problem is we're rushing to gather data and develop metrics without necessarily know what it is that we're trying to measure in the first place, or even what the best way to measure that is. And I think, to Tom's point, we need to think about what is relevant to business performance. And I choose those words very carefully. I don't necessarily mean financial materiality. I don't know whether you can draw a bright line between whether the quality of a company's benefits are financially material. I suspect they are. It's going to be material to your workforce, certainly the people that work at your company who create the thing that you sell. So there are many, many issues, certainly with the just capital measures, that are financially relevant, material to business competitiveness and performance on October the 21st, 2020. There's no doubt. And that covers how a company's doing on racial equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It encompasses a company's response to COVID-19, how they're handling issues of pay, benefits, training, how they're supporting all the other stakeholders. So there's no doubt in my mind that those things matter to business performance today. The question is, how do you measure them? And there's a lot of work done on standards, on metrics. There's been less investment in new sources of data where you can actually develop meaning. Those of you who've heard me speak on this subject are probably bored of hearing me say this, but we've focused so much on quantity over quality. And it's about time we began to think about measuring stakeholder performance properly in a meaningful way and ensuring that we have the data to drive that analysis. On the one hand, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. It's 750 years since Italian monks invented double entry bookkeeping, and we still don't know how to measure intangible value. 85% of market value today is intangible value. Tell me what that is. That is how a company treats its workers. It's its brand, customer loyalty, pricing power. All of those things are driven by this notion of how a company really creates value for its stakeholders. So I think we have a huge amount of interest here to actually begin now to say, okay, time out. How do we build a meaningful set of metrics that are actually going to measure value creation for different stakeholders? We can agree on that. At least we'll have a real conversation then about, okay, well, how do you measure value creation for workers. What is that? Is that just higher wages? Is that a path to upward economic mobility? Is that just simply being treated fairly in the workplace? What does value creation mean today in the modern workplace? So I think that's a really important exercise. And, I'm looking forward to working with both of you and anyone else who's on this call or this event, on that subject.
So you talked about the need to build these metrics, and now is a moment in time where we could do that. Thoughts on how we start? Like who leads the charge, if you will?
I'm happy to jump in, and I'll be quick because I think this is we could talk about this all day. So you have the Business Roundtable put a line in the sand, right? We are about creating value for our stakeholders. So I think now there is momentum, or certainly a rationale to say, okay, what does that mean? When you say we're creating value for these different stakeholders, what are we talking about? So that's a conversation that has to happen. Second, World Economic Forum has probably done some of the best work on framing what they call core and expanded metrics for measuring company performance across a range of stakeholder criteria. Beneath that, you've got very detailed work that's been done by SASB and GRI, other groups out of the European Union, other groups that are tracking stakeholder governance. So I'm thinking of B-Lab. So there's a lot of work gone on very down in the weeds, but at the highest level, I think we have to say, okay, let's get the most influential CEOs and business leaders, business thinkers, policymakers, dare I say it as well, to come together to say, okay, let's just have a conversation about this and try and go one step deeper. What exactly do we mean when we say stakeholder value creation, stakeholder performance?
Michelle, just to add a couple of points there as well. I think first, a lot of people have not really focused on the fact that the SEC actually took a very significant development this summer, where they finalized amendments to Reg SK that actually create a principles-based human capital management disclosure. So in other words, companies have to determine what is the best information for investors, and they would have to do this in conjunction with their investors. What is that information that is important for investors to know in terms of their human capital disclosure? Additionally, management discussion and analysis does provide an opportunity for companies to talk about forward-looking data in a way that's more of a dialogue than anything else. But again, I think it comes back to materiality. What happens too often now is that data is given to different firms, and they come up with widely different assessments as to how they rate companies. So again, there's some discussion about this now because of the Department of Labor's rule. But again, if we use economic return as that basis of why we are having disclosures and having this data, that provides us an anchor for how we can start to rationalize it. So the other point I would say too, it's extremely important for companies that there's somebody who owns this within a company. Too often, when you talk about sustainability, ESG issues, whatever, it gets split up in many different parts of the company, and really somebody has to own it, because then the business community can work directly through unified voices in conversation with investors, policymakers, other parties, that we can actually come up with a system that's going to work.
That's an interesting point. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I just want to build on something Tom said. I'm less worried about rating agencies on ESG issues having different opinions. I actually think it'd be pretty. I'm just naturally suspicious, I guess. But if they all agreed, I'd wonder what was happening. I think having difference of opinions is a good feature of a healthy marketplace. Where I have a problem is transparency. I don't know why those opinions differ. I often don't know what the methodology is by which those opinions have been arrived at. One of the things it just does that we've sort of built into our DNA is transparency in our methodology. At least you might disagree with how we're measuring something, but you'll know how we're measuring it, and you'll know why. So I think that's really important. Without transparency, you don't have trust. If I were to say to you, oh, I'm starting a fund and I'm going to invest in companies that have a policy to be profitable, you'd probably be a bit suspicious. It's the same thing with stakeholder issues. It's not enough to have a policy to be a good employer or to pay a fair wage or to provide good benefits. What you want to see is actual performance, right? And how do you measure that? And that's why we have third-party auditors. So I just think more transparency around some of these issues, more sort of thoughtful, independent analysis will actually help the market and help companies. We speak to companies all the time who recognize that they actually do want to be better on many of the things that we track, because it helps them attract talent and retain talent. It helps them have conversations with investors who are worried about climate or other, stakeholder-related issues. It just helps them have healthier relationships with their suppliers. There's a lot of benefits from that, and I'm not a radical, about this. But I do feel as though if you look at the arc of disclosure on companies, going back to the 20s, it's only going in one direction. And that's more and more meaningful disclosure and more meaningful analysis on changing business competitive conditions. That's really what's going on here. The stakeholder model is really a mirror. It's a reflection of society today and what we value. So if companies want to compete in that marketplace, it stands to reason you want to be good at those things and be seen as being good. And I think that's where transparency and trust in business, can only be beneficial.
And Martin, I would just agree with you that transparency and process are important to understand the rationale of decision and decision making, and then you can have a credible discussion of it. And I think Just Capital, to its credit, I think is in a different place than many others, because with others, it's difficult to understand what those decisions are or how they're made. And that leads to a credibility gap.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump in here and just remind folks to please post questions in, you can do it through the chat function on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter at hashtag BPC Live. I'll throw out one or two more, and then we'll flip it over to the audience questions. So one of the corporate issues that has drawn a good deal of interest and concern in the last few years is the concentration of shareholding. So the big four asset managers hold a large chunk of shares in publicly traded companies. And while they hold those shares on behalf of millions of Americans, especially for retirement plans, it's created concern about who holds the most influence as shareholders. If we're going to retain shareholder as primary, how should we address the issue of concentrated shareholder? And I know that the SEC has done some stuff around this, but would either of you care to comment on, or Tom, if you want to jump in?
Sure. So, if you go back a couple of years, Jack Bogle's last op-ed in the Wall Street Journal talked about this, where he said, there's a concentration of several large passive investors, and that this was distorting, some things in corporate governance, et cetera. And, look, I would say this: there's passive investing, active investing. We need both, right? One of the things we can't lose sight of here is that public pensioners, Mr. and Mrs. 401k, are, they need to ensure that they're going to have the return to ensure, that they can have that retirement that they need. There are, some suggested, solutions to this problem that also don't make any sense either. So there's this concept of common ownership of, if you have this concentrated investor base or whatever, in just a few companies, well, then an investor, an institutional investor, can only invest in one company per industry. Does it really make sense if an institutional investor is going to have to choose either Intel or Qualcomm? So I think that's why, the concept of materiality is important. The fact is that, passive investing has allowed for the democratization of investing. And it's just, we need both in order to achieve the appropriate risk tolerances that an investor has, and working within the bounds of materiality with the SEC rules, with the securities laws, that this will just work out fine. And look, and at the end of the day, that individual is going to determine where they're going to put their money in for their best livelihood. So I think it's a little bit of a misnomer, but we need to ensure we have a balanced system that works.
Great. So I'm kind of going. Oh, go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, I'm just saying we do a lot of work with the investment community at Just, and it's very important to us. And I see this question kind of through that lens of shareholder interest and investor interest in sort of stakeholder and sustainable investing. Obviously, everybody sees how fast it's growing, how important it's becoming, and so I sort of feel like there's just a burgeoning appetite from investors for more data. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have more meaningful data, more meaningful metrics, because if this is getting into the hands of investors who are then, using this as part of an engagement program, there's got to be good information. So it's got to be reliable. It's got to be trustworthy. So I think that, we've seen obviously growth in passive funds. We produce indexes and we've licensed them to asset managers, and those are passive products. But because Just Capital is sort of behind them, we have an active corporate engagement program that is actually driving change, which brings me to my point, which is as we see the growth of sustainable investing and stakeholder-related investing, I think there's going to be a lot more attention focused on what impact that is actually having. And so I expect we're going to see an intensification of these issues. I expect there will be a lot of conversations about what does governance look like in the 21st century. Do we need any, how do we interpret that? If investors really believe this is financially material, then we should be looking at this, but are we equipped to do that? Are our structures equipped to handle that kind of a conversation properly and constructively, not in an adversarial fashion? So I think we're about to have several years of much more intense conversation about the roles of investors and their sort of role in corporate governance overall.
Okay, that'll be fun. So we got a couple questions from the chat room. So from Jacob Drummond, looking to the future, do we need to address how students learn about this topic? How should future leaders learn how to balance other stakeholders in their decision making? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I think it is extremely important for students to understand these issues because, again, it comes back to what is the role of a corporation in society, and what is the role of government in society, and how is it that corporations can be good corporate citizens, but we also have to understand this, right? The economy and businesses are not static. They evolve with time. Materiality evolves with time. There's a reason why we have a creative destructive cycle. Propping up businesses such as a buggy whip maker, right, doesn't make any sense today, right? The market has dictated that. What is important here is, and I think I think we're having a very robust discussion about progressive politics and free market politics in the United States today. The issues that Martin and I are talking about today are being driven by the market. They're being driven by investors. They're being driven by businesses. And that is a very healthy, robust way to go. Our counterparts in the European Union are going in a much different direction. Well, interestingly enough, about 5 or 6 years ago, I had a meeting with some people from the Council of Ministers of the European Union where they asked me to come in to talk about how is it that businesses get started and funded in the United States. And I walked them through that. And it was very apparent that the risk tolerances and our systems were just very different. And somebody said to me as we were walking out the door, there's a reason why we don't have a Google or an Amazon in the European Union. So there are some special things that we do here in the United States that provide people with a higher standard of living an opportunity to advance themselves, and frankly, to solve some problems that maybe government doesn't have the will to do. And I think that is important.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a great question, Jacob. I feel that if you are taught that businesses should only think about investing in stakeholders when they're already very profitable, and that this is somehow a luxury, not serious. It's not really, a core business tenet. Then that's how the next generation of business leaders are taught. Obviously, that's what they're going to believe. And so I think, to Tom's point, we evolve. We evolve the way we see markets, and we evolve the way we should teach business. And business, looking ahead into the future, business will have to grapple with all sorts of different societal challenges that weren't relevant to business, or at least weren't seen as being relevant to business, in the previous generation. That's what's changed. And I expect it will change a generation from now. We'll be talking about a whole new set of business priorities. But I do think there are some things that remain solid and steadfast, and that is the need to make a profit, the need to invest in those assets in your business that help you generate that long-term success. Those are your stakeholders. And I think that how you do that, how you measure that, how you prioritize that, that's where I'm looking forward to actually learning from the next generation of business leaders about what we've done wrong. But the short answer is absolutely yes. That's a critical issue.
Great. And so one final question from our audience, which I think is a really good one to end this event on, given the election is now less than 2 weeks away. Ariel Bagley, what corporate governance issues are at stake this election, especially for financial service firms? We don't hear a whole lot about these issues, but
I think there are a few issues, and I think the issues that might be out there are slightly different than they were 4 years ago. The SEC has wrapped up a series of corporate governance reforms with proxy advisory firms of regulation, as well as shareholder proposal reforms. We'll have to see, depending on how the elections go, if those reforms survive. I think some of the issues that we're talking about here, in terms of ESG, the role of disclosure, I think are issues that we will be having discussions about, which is why I think that human capital disclosure was so important, because that provides a template for how we might be moving forward. And I would just say too, if you take a look at what the European Union may be doing with the Sustainability Directive, we may be getting a different point of view coming from overseas. So I think regardless of the election, we're going to be debating these issues for quite some time.
Yeah, I think regardless of the election outcome, or whoever wins, the same basic trends will continue. This is a secular shift, a societal shift, where business competition is just fundamentally changing. What matters, what's relevant to that's fundamentally changing. And that's going to continue. So the basic tenets of the stakeholder approach won't change. There will be elements of, and there are differences in approach to things such as the administration's or the respective administration's potential future attitudes to disclosure. What matters, materiality, how the SEC interprets that. So there will be changes around that. But I also think the basic, the basic trends are not going to change, and we're going to, regardless of whether we have a Biden administration or another Trump administration, we're going to be talking about the need for stakeholder performance and how markets and business, can be better and work better for more Americans.
All right. Well, we'll let that be the last word for the day. Thank you so much to Martin and Tom and Jason and Chris from the first panel. This was a really great discussion. And speaking of the election, we are going to reconvene ourselves, hopefully for another discussion after the election, once we know who is in control of the various chambers in the White House. So stay tuned for more information on that. Thank you all for joining us today. And my other phone is ringing. So with that, we'll end the day. Thank you all very, very much.